4 Mercedes engines that you need to watch out for. And when I'm talking about these 4 Mercedes engines, I'm not talking about engines that you should watch out for because they're exciting or cool. I mean, because they can often have hidden issues that are unexpected and very annoying to deal with. And we're not going to go over the popular engines either, the popular bad engines like the OM603.970. Instead, we're going to go over some engines that you might, that really require a lot of corrective action, but they can become good engines if they are not, completely destroyed. So the first of these engines is the M116.960, 961 and 962, and these are and then some early 963 engines that were made prior to September of 1983, and these are the 3.8 liter engines with single overhead camshafts and single row timing chains. Now, the notoriety of the 380 SL, 380 SEL, and 380 SEC that had these single row chains probably goes as far back into Mercedes lore as most of us will remember. And one of the reasons that these engines were so problematic was because the single row timing chains would stretch and they'd break the chain guides, and then they'd either jump because they were super stretched or jump because they got wrapped up in a broken piece of chain guide. Either way, once that happened, you were pulling the heads and replacing all the valves and pulling the motor and putting all the gears in it to upgrade to a double row chain. And this engine was not necessarily a bad engine, but in order to make it a good engine, and you really need to be prepared for this, off go the oil pans and front timing covers, and if you damage the head gaskets where they attach to the front timing cover, off go the cylinder heads. And when the cylinder heads go off, you have to helicoil the engine block, all to make that 3.8 liter engine run a little bit better. Now, there are some alternatives to this problem that are sometimes, I think, a little bit better, although there's no such thing as a perfect solution. But the later engines, the 4.2 and the 5.6 liter engines, if you swap over the fuel injection system, will actually work in this case. But you have to change the throttle plate and the fuel distributor, and you have to change the injectors out. But for the most part, you can actually use and you have to change the whole intake manifold because of the mounting boss for the warm-up regulator. But as long as you swap out the intake manifold for the early intake, you can run a 4.2 liter engine. I personally prefer to fix the original engines, but for someone who doesn't really want to go through all the pain and suffering and can locate a good 4.2 liter engine, why not? Now, a second engine you really have to watch out for are the OM617.910 and 912 non-turbo 5-cylinder diesels. But wait, aren't these some of the legendary Mercedes diesel engines? And the truth is that they are and they aren't. A certain combination of how people drove in the United States, like how they just sort of run their cars into the ground, and the low quality of our diesel fuel, which had way too much sulfur and way too much water in it, would cause a lot of issues with these early non-turbo 5-cylinders. And this was uniquely because they had so much rotating mass, but they only used 615, which were 220D connecting rods. And the connecting rods were not sufficiently strengthened until later on when they went to a 616 part number on the later small glow plug engines. Now, which 5-cylinder non-turbo engines am I actually talking about? Well, the ones I most frequently think of that have low compression, connecting rod, main bearing issues, basically engine destruction, stuff that leads to the destruction of the engine, are the 75 and 76 300D. And the 77 through 79 300D, and then to a lesser extent the 80 and 81 300D, although all of these engines can equally be affected, especially when you get, somebody's teenage daughter driving their 300D around. Now, these engines should be, if you're looking for a really great car that's been well taken care of, if the engine doesn't run as well as you think it should, it's always a good idea to do a compression test and an oil analysis, and maybe even pull the pre-chambers out and look inside the engine with a camera. And what you're looking for is cylinder wall pitting, scoring, all the things that lead to low compression. But a compression test will, tell you everything. And a lot of the time I find these engines have high oil consumption and they fail compression tests on multiple cylinders. Now, it doesn't mean that they're bad if the person who's doing the compression test doesn't know how to do a compression test in a diesel, or they're using low quality equipment. So keep that in mind. Now, a third problem that we run into with older Mercedes engines that we watch out for are on the catalytic converter era or thermoreactor era cars. And the engine I'm going to warn you about next is the M110.921 that was used in the 280, the 280S, the 280C. I think that was it. I can't remember, but I think that the 280 had what was called an M110.920. But these engines were very low compression. They did not have sufficient oil supply to the camshaft, so you have to check for camshaft wear and tear. And they had that thermal reactor, so they'd run really hot, so you want to make sure that the head gasket is not cooked or the head's not warped. These engines can be made into decent engines, but you have to take the thermal reactor off and either fit a set of 73, 74 exhaust manifolds, or you have to gut the thermal reactor. The thermal reactor was not a great solution to the catalytic converter problem. So if you need a catalytic converter and you live in like California or Arizona or one of those other states where they have ridiculous rules for old cars, it's a good idea to replace the exhaust system with a later system like a 77, 78 and later catalytic converter if you have a 116. And if you have a 123, a 115, a 114 with this engine, then God help you, because you're going to have to come up with a creative solution for the catalyst. But again, you should be very concerned about these engines. Now, the last engine that we're going to talk about on this list that I think many people often don't realize was such a problematic engine was the M102.980 and 980. Maybe it was the 980. Maybe it was the 981. This is the engine used in the early 190E 2.3, as well as the 230E, which was Europe only, but a lot of them came here. The 230CE and TE were also popular variants, as was the 230GE Geländewagen. Now, this engine has a very robust bottom end that will go for 500,000 miles, but the top end was plagued with valve guide wear issues, and it was also plagued with head gasket failure issues because they had a semi-open deck block. That means that you didn't see a lot of metal covering the area between the head gasket and the cylinder liners, and so coolant would get underneath the head gasket and start to eat it away, and then you'd get head gasket failure, and then that would be that. Your engine would basically be history. And this happened on my own 87 190E, and when I pulled the head gasket off, there was pitting on cylinder number 1 that had been going on for a long time. It wasn't enough pitting to cause the engine to have low compression, but that engine did not run nearly as well as I think it should have. I mean, it didn't run badly, but when coolant gets into a cylinder, it'll start eating up the cylinder walls. So that's something to keep in mind if you ever have a head gasket failure. Anyway, I hope you guys like this video. Please, share it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. And if you are looking at acquiring one of these Mercedes with these engines, there are some extra steps you really should go through, whether it's checking the cooling system or checking for an oil analysis or checking compression or pulling the valve covers and looking at the camshafts and the timing chain to make sure you don't buy a dud. We'll see you in the next